She said it on a Tuesday morning, the same way she said everything, casually while doing something else, as if the words cost her nothing because they were simply true. I'm Daniel. I'm 37 years old, I'm a graphic designer, and I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing my coffee mug when my wife of 8 years told me, for what I later counted as the 412th time, that I was nothing. She didn't use that word exactly. She rarely used that word exactly. She was too precise for that. What she said was, "I don't know why I expected anything different from you." She was looking at her phone when she said it. She didn't look up. The sentence landed the way her sentences always landed. Not like a blow, but like a slow, steady pressure applied to a specific point until the structure beneath it gave way. I had been standing at that sink for 8 years. The structure had been giving way for most of them. I rinsed the mug. I set it on the rack. I looked out the window at the backyard. The oak tree, the kids' swing set, the fence I'd repainted last summer while she stood on the porch and told me I was doing it wrong. Something happened in that moment that I don't know how to describe precisely except to say that it was very quiet and very final. Not anger, not grief, something below both of those. A settling. The specific internal sensation of a man who has just reached the bottom of something and found, unexpectedly, that the bottom is solid. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands. I did not say anything. But something in me, the part that had been eroding for 8 years, the part that had learned to agree and defer and absorb and minimize, that part made a decision so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Almost. Let me tell you who I was before Claire, because the person I became inside that marriage was built on top of someone else, and that original person matters to the story. I grew up in a quiet house in Eastern Oregon, the younger of 2 brothers. Marcus was 4 years older, steadier, the kind of person who knew what he thought and said it without rehearsal. I was the one who smoothed things over, between my parents when they argued, between Marcus and my father when they disagreed, between everyone and everything that threatened the fragile equilibrium of our household. I learned early that my value was in my usefulness, that love was something you maintained through accommodation, that the best version of me was the version that created the least friction. I carried that into every relationship I had, and into the marriage I built with Claire. We met in 2014 at a design conference in Portland. She was in marketing, sharp and confident and magnetically certain of her own opinions. I found that certainty compelling in the way that people find compelling the thing they themselves lack. She knew what she thought. She said it without apology. She laughed loudly and took up space and seemed to require nothing from anyone. What I didn't understand at 29 was the difference between confidence and contempt. They can look identical from the outside, especially when the contempt is selective, directed inward, at the people close enough to matter, while the confidence faces outward toward the world. We were married in June 2016. Sophie arrived 18 months later. Noah came 2 years after that. The first sign arrived before the wedding. We were planning the ceremony, a small outdoor event, nothing elaborate, and I had suggested a particular venue, a restored farmhouse outside Millfield that I thought suited us. Claire dismissed it without looking at the photographs. "That's not what I want," she said. "I don't know why you'd suggest that. Not I prefer something different. Not let me see other options." The specific formulation she used, "I don't know why you'd suggest that," positioned my input not as a different preference but as a category error, as evidence of a failure to understand something fundamental. I apologized. I let her choose the venue. I told myself that was love. Looking back now, that was the template for everything that followed. Not a single dramatic moment but a structural pattern, established early and reinforced constantly. My suggestions were wrong. My instincts were unreliable. My judgment required her correction. Each individual instance was small enough to absorb. The accumulation was something else entirely. The gaslighting began so gradually that I have difficulty now identifying a clear starting point, which is, I understand precisely how gaslighting works. It doesn't announce itself. It rewrites history in increments small enough to seem like misremembering. There was an evening in our second year when I was certain, completely certain, that we had agreed I would handle Sophie's daycare pickup on Thursdays because Claire had a standing meeting. I had rearranged my work schedule around it. When Thursday arrived and I went to the daycare, Claire called me 20 minutes later, voice tight with controlled irritation, to ask why I hadn't told her I was changing the arrangement. "We agreed," I said, "last Sunday, at breakfast." "That's not what happened," she said. "I don't know what you're remembering, but that's not what happened." I stood in the daycare parking lot with Sophie on my hip and tried to locate the Sunday breakfast conversation in my memory. It was there, clear, specific, detailed. And yet the certainty in Claire's voice was the kind that makes your own memory feel soft and unreliable. She didn't sound like someone misremembering. She sounded like someone correcting a factual error. I apologized. I said I must have gotten confused. I was not confused. I understood that later, much later, when I had enough distance to trust my own recollections again. But in the moment, standing in that parking lot, I chose her certainty over my own because I had been trained to do so long before she arrived. She had simply recognized the training and put it to use. Marcus visited that autumn. He stayed for a weekend, and on the Sunday morning he and I walked along the river trail outside town while Claire stayed home with Sophie. We didn't talk about the marriage directly. Marcus is not a man who forces conversations. But at one point he said, without preamble, "You seem tired, Daniel. Not just physically." "It's been a busy year," I said. He looked at me with the particular expression of an older brother who has decided to say one thing and stop. "You don't have to manage everything all the time," he said. "That's not what marriage is supposed to feel like." I said I knew that. I didn't know that. Or rather, I knew it abstractly, the way you know things that have no application to your actual life. I had no framework for a marriage that didn't require constant management, because I had never been in one. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened in the middle years of the marriage, because the experience of living inside psychological abuse is not linear and does not feel, from the inside, the way it looks from the outside. From the outside, I imagine it looked like a quiet couple in a small Oregon town. Daniel and Claire. 2 kids, a nice house, a graphic design career conducted mostly from a home studio, a wife who was professionally successful and socially charming. People liked Claire. She was funny at dinner parties and generous with compliments to friends and possessed of a warmth in public that was entirely genuine. The warmth was real, I want to say that. It was simply not available inside our house. Inside our house, the temperature was different. The criticism was constant but calibrated, never enough to constitute a clear incident, always enough to maintain a specific pressure. My cooking was edible but not good. My parenting was present but not engaged. My work was adequate but not inspired. My opinions were acknowledged and then, within the same sentence, repositioned as slightly missing the point. I was always close to right, never quite there. The financial control arrived so gradually I didn't name it as control until I tried to buy Marcus a birthday gift in our 4th year and realized I had to justify the amount to Claire before the purchase. Not because money was tight. My freelance income was substantial and we were comfortable. Because she had, over 4 years, constructed a household financial architecture in which all significant spending required her approval. I had accepted each individual step in the construction because each one had a reasonable justification at the time. I understand now that the justifications were the architecture. The control was the point. In the 5th year, she began working on my friendships. Not dramatically, not through prohibition. She never forbade me anything directly, which was part of the precision of her method. She worked through commentary. Joel, my closest friend from college, was described as immature. My colleague Petra was a little much. My friendship with a neighbor named Greg was met with a series of observations about Greg's reliability, his judgment, his wife's opinion of him, until the friendship became associated in my mind with a low-level unease that I couldn't justify logically but couldn't entirely ignore either. Within 2 years, my social world had contracted to the dimensions of our household. Not because anyone had been explicitly excluded, because the cost of maintaining each connection had been incrementally raised until most of them quietly lapsed. I didn't see it while it was happening. I was too close and too tired and too thoroughly convinced, by that point, that my perceptions were unreliable. That was the year I started waking at 3 in the morning. Not from nightmares. From a specific mental alertness, a kind of emergency readiness that had no object. I would lie in the dark beside Claire and run through the previous day, cataloging the interactions. identifying the moments I had said the wrong thing or failed to anticipate her reaction or caused, through some failure of attentiveness, one of the quiet, controlled expressions of disappointment that had become the primary weather system of our marriage. I was trying to figure out how to do better. It took me a long time to understand that doing better was not the mechanism she was offering. The mechanism she was offering required me to keep trying and keep failing and keep apologizing, because the trying and failing and apologizing were the product. My diminishment was not the unfortunate side effect of her behavior. It was its purpose. The children saw more than I wanted them to see. Sophie was 7 by then, perceptive and quiet in the way of children who have learned to read a room early. She had a specific behavior I noticed and couldn't stop noticing. When Claire and I were in the same space and the temperature shifted, Sophie would find a reason to stand near me. Not between us, just near me, as if proximity were a form of ballast. I told myself she was just being affectionate. I did not let myself examine what she might be sensing, because examining it would have required me to see my children as witnesses to something I hadn't yet admitted was happening. I didn't need to gather proof the way a man gathering evidence of infidelity needs to gather proof. The evidence of what Claire was doing was present in every room of our house. Every day. What I needed to gather was something different. The proof that my own perceptions were accurate. That I wasn't, as she had suggested in 100 calibrated ways across 8 years, the problem. That process began with a therapist named Dr. Wendell. I started seeing him in the spring of our 7th year, telling Claire it was for work-related stress, which was partially true, and which she accepted with the faint skepticism she applied to most of my self-reports. The first 3 sessions I spent describing my marriage in the careful, self-correcting language I had developed over years. I think I sometimes misread situations. I probably contributed to the tension. I know I can be difficult to communicate with. Dr. Wendell listened to all of it. Then he said, "You've described several situations in which you were certain of something. A conversation, an agreement, a sequence of events, and your wife told you your memory was wrong. How often does that happen?" I thought about it. "Regularly," I said. "And when it happens, do you usually conclude that she's right?" "Usually," I said. "She's very certain." He nodded slowly. "Daniel," he said, "certainty isn't the same as accuracy." That sentence did something I can only describe as structural. Like a single bolt being correctly tightened in a frame that had been slightly misaligned for years. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet, precise correction that changed the load distribution of everything around it. I came back the following week. And the week after that. Dr. Wendell didn't diagnose Claire. He was careful about that, appropriately. He worked with what I described and helped me identify patterns. The consistent repositioning of my perceptions as errors. The financial architecture that required my justification. The social attrition that had left me, by the 7th year of my marriage, with a social world consisting almost entirely of Claire's selection. The 3 a.m. alertness. The perpetual calibration. He used the word gaslighting in our 4th session. He used it carefully as a descriptor rather than a verdict. He said, "When someone consistently and repeatedly tells you that your accurate memories are wrong, your reliable perceptions are distorted, and your reasonable judgments are failures, that has a name. And the name matters because naming it is the first step to understanding that the problem is not your perception." I sat with that word for a week. Then I called Marcus. I told him everything, not a curated version, not the self-correcting language. Everything. The daycare parking lot. The birthday gift. The 3 a.m. cataloging. Sophie standing near me when the temperature shifted. Marcus was quiet for a long time after I finished. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, he said. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it," he said. "And because every time I got close to saying it, you defended her. You always defended her, Daniel. Right up until now." He was right. I had defended her because defending her was the same as defending the version of myself that had chosen her, the version that had believed, for 8 years, that if I was patient enough and accommodating enough and self-effacing enough, the warmth she showed the world would eventually turn fully toward me. It had not turned. It had never been aimed in my direction in the first place. I began, quietly and without announcement, to prepare. Not dramatically. I didn't consult lawyers immediately or move money or plan an exit with military precision. I simply started doing the things I had stopped doing. I called Joel. He answered on the second ring and said, "Daniel," with a warmth that told me the friendship had not actually lapsed. It had just been waiting. I called Greg. I accepted a commission from a new client without mentioning it to Claire first. And when she asked about my schedule, I gave her a general answer and did not apologize for the vagueness. Small things. Incremental. The careful, quiet reassembly of a self that had been disassembled piece by piece over 8 years. Claire noticed the shift. I knew she noticed it because the calibration changed, the criticism became slightly more direct, the certainty slightly more forceful, as if she could sense that the usual pressure was no longer producing the usual yield. There was an evening when she looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, something closer to assessment. Like a person recalibrating their estimate of a structure they thought they understood. I held her gaze and said nothing. That was new. The Tuesday morning with the coffee mug was not the moment I decided to leave. It was the moment I realized I had already decided, that the decision had been made somewhere in the preceding months, quietly and without ceremony, and the Tuesday morning was simply the moment it became visible to me. I'm Daniel. I told you that at the beginning. And the thing about being Daniel, about being the person I had spent 37 years becoming, was that I didn't do scenes. I didn't build to confrontations. I didn't require a climactic moment of reckoning. What I required was clarity. And I had it. I did not tell Claire I was leaving that Tuesday. I went to work. I designed a logo for a client in Seattle. I picked Noah up from school and made him a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table watching him eat it and thought about the specific texture of an ordinary afternoon with my son. The way he narrated his own eating, the serious consideration he gave to the arrangement of his plate, the absolute present tense completeness of a 5-year-old who has no awareness of the architecture around him. I thought, he deserves to grow up watching his father be a person. Not a managed surface. Not a set of calibrated responses to another person's moods. Person. With opinions and instincts and the right to occupy space without justification. Sophie came home an hour later. She dropped her backpack by the door. I had been asking her to hang it up for a year. She never remembered. I had stopped caring about it in the way I had stopped caring about many things that turned out to be unimportant. And she came into the kitchen and stood next to me at the counter and said, with no preamble, "Dad, are you okay?" I looked at her. 7 years old, dark eyes, the serious expression she wore when she was paying full attention. "I'm getting there," I said. She nodded, as if this was a satisfactory and complete answer, and went to find her brother. I called Patricia that evening, the family attorney Marcus had recommended 2 months earlier, whose number I'd had in my phone since March. The conversation was practical and informative and conducted in the quiet of my car in the driveway while Claire was putting the kids to bed. The following Saturday, while Claire was at her mother Irene's house with the children for a regular afternoon visit, I packed 2 bags. Not everything. Enough. My work equipment, my essential documents, the things that were specifically mine. I called Marcus and he came with his truck without asking questions, and we loaded the bags in 20 minutes, and I took one last walk through the house. The kids' rooms. Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator. The swing set in the backyard. The oak tree, the fence I'd painted last summer. The kitchen window above the sink. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up my keys. I left a letter on the kitchen table. Not long. I had thought about what to say for weeks and had concluded that less was more accurate. I told Claire that I was leaving, that I was not angry, that the marriage was over, and that everything regarding the children would be handled through my attorney with the intention of being fair and in the children's best interest. I told her I wished her well and meant it. I did not apologize. That was new too. Marcus drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched Millfield pass outside the window, the hardware store, the school, the river trail where he told me I seemed tired in the first year of my marriage. The town looked the same as it always had. I felt different inside it than I ever had before. Not happy. Not yet. But present. Fully, accurately present in my own life, in my own body, in my own unmediated perception of the world passing outside the window. That was enough for one day. I stayed at Marcus's house for 6 weeks while Patricia worked through the initial stages of the separation. Claire's response to the letter was not what I had expected, though I'm not sure, looking back, what I had expected. She called Marcus's number that Saturday evening. He handed me the phone without comment. She was controlled on the call, the way she was always controlled, but beneath the control there was something I hadn't heard before. Not remorse exactly, something more like genuine incomprehension, as if my departure had revealed a gap between her model of me and the actual person, and the gap was larger than she'd calculated. "I don't understand," she said. "We could have talked about this. We talked for 8 years," I said. "Or you talked and I listened and then apologized. That's not the same thing." A pause. "The children need stability," she said. "I agree," I said. "I'm their father. I'll be there." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You seem different." "I am different," I said. "I've been working on it." I handed the phone back to Marcus. The divorce took 10 months. Claire retained a skilled attorney and contested several things: the asset division, the custody arrangement, the timeline. She was, in the legal arena as in the domestic one, precise and controlled and oriented toward outcome. But she was working, this time, against a version of me that had stopped deferring, and the difference was significant. We settled on joint custody, week on week off, with a detailed parenting agreement that specified decision-making processes clearly enough that most of the room for the kind of ambiguity she had historically exploited was removed. Patricia had been thorough. I had been specific about what I needed. Those two things together produced a document that worked. The first weekend I had Sophie and Noah in the new apartment, a 2-bedroom place on the east side of Millfield, small and plain and entirely mine. I made pancakes and let Noah put too many blueberries in his and sat across from both of them at a table I'd bought the previous week and felt the specific, quiet quality of a space that had only one weather system. My weather system, mild and consistent and not subject to calibration. Sophie looked around the apartment at breakfast with the evaluative attention she brought to new environments. "It smells like your studio," she said. "Paint and coffee and the particular wooden smell of the drafting table I'd set up by the window." "That's because it's mine," I said. She seemed to find this reasonable. I went back to Dr. Wendell Weekly for another year. The work was different now, less excavation, more construction. Learning to inhabit my own perceptions without automatically second-guessing them. Learning to disagree without apologizing for the disagreement. Learning, slowly and imperfectly, that love and endurance of pain were not the same thing and had never been the same thing, regardless of what I'd been taught. Joel came for dinner one Friday night. We talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, the way old friends do when the distance between them has been bridged and there's a backlog of ordinary conversation to work through. Near the end of the evening, he said, "You look like yourself." "I'm getting there," I said. The same thing I'd told Sophie. He raised his glass. "That's worth drinking to." Marcus called every Sunday morning. Not to check on me, or not only to check on me, just to talk. The way brothers talk when they've stopped performing fineness for each other and can simply be in each other's company across the distance. He told me once, midway through the first year, that watching me leave had been one of the proudest moments of his life. I told him that seemed like a low bar. He said, "You'd be surprised how high that bar actually is." I thought about that for a long time. The thing I had been most afraid of in all the years of not leaving was that leaving would mean I had wasted those years. That choosing to go would be an admission that staying had been wrong from the beginning, and that admission felt too large to survive. What I found, on the other side, was that the years hadn't been wasted. They had produced Sophie and Noah, who were the least wasted things I had ever been part of. They had taught me, at significant cost but with genuine precision, exactly what I would not accept again. They had stripped away every version of myself that was built on someone else's architecture and left something smaller and quieter and more accurately mine. You don't leave 8 years behind. You carry them differently. Last spring, Noah drew a picture at school. The assignment was my family. He drew 4 figures: Claire, himself, Sophie, and me. He gave each figure a color. Claire was purple. Sophie was yellow. He was green. He made me blue. I asked him why blue. He considered the question with the philosophical weight he brought to all important matters. "Blue is calm," he said, "like when it's quiet and good." I put the drawing on the refrigerator. It's still there. What this story is really about is not one person's cruelty. It's about the architecture of a self that was built, long before the marriage began, to absorb punishment and call it love, and the slow, painful, necessary process of dismantling that architecture and building something that actually holds. Daniel didn't enter the marriage as a blank slate upon which Claire inscribed her damage. He arrived with a pre-existing blueprint, learned in childhood, refined across adult relationships, that made him uniquely susceptible to exactly what she offered. His family had taught him that his value was in his usefulness, that love required self-erasure, that the absence of conflict was the highest available good. Claire didn't create those beliefs. She recognized them and used them with precision. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath many stories of psychological abuse. The abuser rarely selects randomly. There is, in most cases, a fit, a specific compatibility between what one person needs to enact and what the other has been prepared to receive. Daniel's accommodation was not weakness in the simple sense. It was a deeply practiced survival strategy from a different context, transplanted into a marriage where it became the mechanism of his own diminishment. Claire's profile is worth examining with some care, because she is not a simple villain. The covert narcissism the story traces through her behavior, the public warmth, the private contempt, the need for control that expressed itself through incremental rather than dramatic means, is a psychological pattern rooted in its own specific fear. People who control others through systematic diminishment are almost always managing an internal landscape of profound insecurity. The contempt is a defense. The control is a response to the terror of powerlessness. None of this excuses what she did. But understanding the mechanism matters, because it prevents a reading of the story that reduces her to pure malice. She was a person in pain, expressing that pain in a direction that caused maximum damage to the person closest to her. What the story tracks most precisely is the cost of the slow erosion. Not a single catastrophic betrayal, but 1,000 small calibrations across 8 years that collectively produced a man who had lost access to his own perceptions. The 3 a.m. alertness is perhaps the most telling detail. A man lying awake cataloging his own failures, trying to figure out how to be better, not understanding that the standard he was being measured against was designed to be unachievable. That is the specific cruelty of gaslighting. It redirects the victim's intelligence and self-awareness against themselves, turning the capacity for self-reflection into an instrument of self-destruction. The recovery Daniel undertakes is appropriately modest and appropriately unglamorous. There is no dramatic confrontation, no moment of public reckoning, no satisfaction of watching Claire understand the damage she caused. There is a letter on a kitchen table and 2 bags in a truck and a 2-bedroom apartment that smells like paint and coffee. There is a therapist who says certainty isn't the same as accuracy, and a brother who has been waiting 5 years for a phone call, and a daughter who stands close to her father when the temperature shifts. The story's final image, Noah's drawing, the blue figure, calm, like when it's quiet and good, earns its place not because it is redemptive in a theatrical sense but because it is accurate. A 5-year-old has perceived something real about his father that the father is still learning to believe about himself. Children see what we present without the layers of self-management we apply for adults. Noah drew what he actually saw. That is, in the end, the most reliable evidence Daniel has that the work is real. What strikes me most about this story is not the abuse itself. It's the patience of it. 8 years. 8 years of small corrections and quiet contempt and 3 a.m. audits of his own failures. And throughout all of it, Daniel kept trying to be better. Kept believing that the right adjustment, the right level of accommodation would finally be enough. That's the part that stays with me. Not the cruelty. The hope. Because I think most people who stay in situations that diminish them aren't staying out of weakness. They're staying out of a very specific, very human refusal to believe that the person they love is actually doing what they're doing. That hope is not stupidity. It's loyalty applied to the wrong object. The question worth sitting with is this: are you extending that kind of hope to someone who has never once tried to deserve it? Sometimes the most courageous thing isn't fighting back. It's simply picking up your keys and walking out the door.